Everyone tells the same version of this story. A swamp, a battlefield, bodies that sank centuries ago and never came back up. End of story, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Because nothing about that water is finished. Nothing about that place has actually ended. And the men who waded into it weren't walking past the dead. They were walking through something that refused to become the past in the first place. Picture the road to Mordor. Black gates in the distance, air that tastes like rust and rot. And somewhere before you reach them, the ground just gives up being ground. It turns to water. Still water. The kind that doesn't ripple even when something underneath it is watching you. Now here's the part that should bother you more than it does. Everywhere else in this world, when a man dies, the earth takes him, quietly, permanently. He becomes soil, becomes memory, becomes a name carved somewhere and slowly worn away by rain. Not here. Here, the faces stay, pale, open-eyed, looking straight up through the water like they're still mid-sentence, still waiting for someone to finish the conversation death interrupted. That's not decomposition. That's not some strange trick of mud and cold. That's a battle that never got the memo it was over.
So let's go back. Let's understand what actually bled into this ground. This wasn't a border skirmish. This wasn't two armies arguing over a hill. This was the last alliance, the one and only time elves and men, two peoples who barely tolerated each other on a good day, looked at the growing dark in the east and said, "Fine, together or not at all." Imagine that for a second. Imagine the weight of it. Not a kingdom fighting for territory, an entire idea of resistance compressed into one brutal collision outside the gates of Mordor. Everything that mattered staked on a single field. They won. Sauron fell. The shadow broke. But nobody talks about what victory actually cost. Because victory, real victory, the kind paid for in bodies, never hands you a receipt you want to read. Thousands died there, elves beside men, soldiers of the enemy tangled in the same mud as the soldiers who killed them. And slowly, over centuries, the marsh did what marshes do. It swallowed them, all of them. No sides anymore, no causes, no gods on either shoulder. Just water and the dead, lying together in the dark. That's usually where the story stops. But that's not what really happened.
Here's the piece almost nobody mentions, the detail that turns a sad graveyard into something genuinely wrong. Those faces under the water, they're not just preserved. They're not just sitting there like museum pieces behind glass. They're bait. Travelers who get too close start seeing lights, pale ones, cold ones, flickering just above the surface like candles held by hands that don't exist anymore. And if you follow them, if you let your eyes stay on those faces a moment too long, something in you starts wanting to join them. This is where it stops being sad and starts being dangerous. Because the marsh isn't hiding bodies anymore at this point. It's making an offer, whispering an idea straight into your chest. The past is realer than you are. Stay. Stop becoming something. Just be finished like they are. The lights aren't guiding you through the swamp. They're guiding you out of the present entirely.
Now sit with that. Really sit with it. The men who crossed those marshes weren't tourists at a memorial, paying respects and moving on. They were walking through an open wound, one where the line between honoring the dead and becoming one of them was thinner than a held breath. And here's the detail that should send a chill straight up your spine. The warning given to travelers was never, "Don't look at the bodies." It was, "Don't follow the lights," which means the corpses were never the danger. The danger was the pull. The danger was something that beautiful, that still, that quietly peaceful, offering itself to anyone tired enough, or grieving enough, or lost enough to say yes. That's not a monster lurking in the swamp. That's grief given a shape, given a glow, given a place to wait. So here it is, the truth almost nobody says out loud. These men weren't crossing a graveyard. They were crossing an unanswered question, one the world never resolved, never closed, never let rest. What happens to glory after the war is won, but the dead refuse to lie down? Because here's the thing people get backwards. The marsh isn't horrifying because of what's in the water. It's horrifying because of what the water means. A victory so enormous, so costly, that even thousands of years later, the ground itself can't let it go. The last alliance didn't just beat Sauron that day. They built, without meaning to, a place where triumph and tragedy fused into one thing, indistinguishable, inseparable. A monument that doesn't honor its dead. It keeps them, it traps them, and it waits patiently for someone alive enough to pull in alongside them. Death ends a story. Everyone knows that. Everyone counts on that. The Dead Marshes don't end anything. They hold those soldiers in a kind of permanent in-between, not honored, not released, not forgotten, just suspended, eyes open, watching the surface, waiting for someone foolish enough to stare back.
And this is where the story stops being about Middle-earth at all. Because every civilization carries its own version of that swamp. Every war, every sacrifice dressed up as necessary. Every triumph that left something behind too heavy to bury properly. We don't call it a marsh, we call it memory, we call it trauma, we call it history, but it does the exact same thing. It glows faintly in the dark, and it waits for us to look a little too long. Sauron's defeat didn't erase him, it just pushed his shadow underwater, where it could sit quietly, patiently, glowing, for anyone willing to bend down and look. Maybe that's the real warning hiding under all that black water. Not that the dead are dangerous, but that meaning itself can rot if nobody tends to it. That history left alone too long stops being something we remember and starts being a current that pulls the present down toward it. Winning a war was never the ending. The ending is whatever you choose to do with what the war left behind.
And maybe that's the part that should actually haunt you tonight. The men who made it across those marshes didn't survive because they were strong. They didn't survive because they were brave or skilled or blessed by some higher power. They survived because in one single fragile moment, they chose not to look down. They chose the cold, uncertain present over a past that was glowing right beneath their feet, whispering that peace was just one step away. Just one. Just lean in. Most people never realize how thin that line actually is. Between remembering someone and following them. Between carrying a war and never putting it down. The Dead Marshes were never a graveyard. They were a question the world was too afraid to answer. And some questions were never built to be answered, only survived.
If that left a knot in your chest, wait until you hear what's actually buried beneath Moria. Because the real reason the dwarves dug too deep has nothing to do with greed. It has to do with something they heard long before they ever swung a single pickaxe. And once you hear it, you'll never look at that mountain the same way again.